There are many who would consider William Butler Yeats to be Ireland's national poet. He came from a very talented family. His father was a wonderful portrait artist, and his brother Jack Yeats was our best-known 20th century artist. Yeats himself went to the art college, but then the poetry took over, and he really did become an extraordinary poet. He also established our national theatre, the Abbey Theatre, in 1904 with Lady Gregory and others. And in his poetry you find many elements of the Celtic twilight, mysticism, romanticism, the fairy tales and Celtic tales of Ireland, and much more besides. He was also in love in his younger days with a woman called Maud Gonne. Unfortunately, she didn't return that love, but much of his early love poetry was written with her in mind, including this poem called He Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven. Had I the heavens' embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, and the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light, and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet, but I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. In the 1850s, Oscar Wilde traveled to the USA and Canada to lecture on art and aesthetics. And he had some unusual audiences, such as in Leadville in Colorado, where he had a group of silver miners. Here's part of his own description of that visit to Leadville. While I was lecturing at Denver, I received a message that if I went on to Leadville, as I proposed to do, the harsher spirits in that wild mining town would be sure to shoot me, or my traveling manager. I wrote back, and I said that nothing they could possibly do to my traveling manager would intimidate me, and I went. It was a gloomy, jolting journey on a gloomy, wet day, 150 miles through the Rocky Mountains, and one arrived at last at a cheerless, snow-covered station. At my lecture the following evening, a baby was present. And when I said that there was no better way of loving nature than through art, the baby burst into tears. I said I wish the juvenile enthusiast would restrain his aesthetic raptures, and all was silent. My audience otherwise was composed mainly of silver miners, whose huge sombre hats, scarlet shirts, and high boots made me think of 17th century cavaliers. Indeed, they were the best-dressed men I had seen since my arrival in the United States. They sat there, rows and rows of them, enormous, powerfully built men, silent as the grave, their eyes watchful, their brawny arms folded over their muscular chests, a loaded gun on each swelling thigh. I spoke to these delightful fellows about the early Florentine schools of painting, and they slept as peacefully as though no crime had ever stained the ravines of their mountain home. I described to them the pictures of Botticelli, and the name, which seemed to them like that of a newly invented drink, roused them from their dreams. I read them passages from the autobiography of that great Florentine genius and adventurer Benvenuto Cellini, and he proved so popular that they asked as a man why the hell I hadn't brought him with me. In the early 1890s, Oscar Wilde had huge success on the London stage with plays like An Ideal Husband, A Woman of No Importance, Lady Windermere's Fan, and of course his most famous play, The Importance of Being Earnest. This is a short extract from his play An Ideal Husband. In it we have Lord Goring, a young man about town who loves to go to parties. And on this evening he's been to one party and he's going to another. And he goes back to his apartment in London to get a fresh flower for the buttonhole on his jacket. He simply calls it a fresh buttonhole. At his apartment he meets two people. The first one is his manservant, Phipps. Now Phipps doesn't say much, but he thinks a lot. And Phipps is waiting with the fresh flower, the fresh buttonhole. "Ah, Phipps, got my second buttonhole?" Yes, my lord. Extraordinary thing, Phipps. I'm the only person in London at present who wears a buttonhole. Yes, my lord. I had observed that. You see, Phipps, fashion is what one wears oneself. What is unfashionable is what other people wear. Yes, my lord. Just as vulgarity is simply the conduct of other people. Yes, my lord. And falsehoods, the truths of other people. Yes, my lord. Other people, Phipps, are quite dreadful. The only possible society is oneself. Yes, my lord. To love oneself, Phipps, is the beginning of a lifelong romance. Yes, my lord. Thank you, Phipps. I don't think I quite like this buttonhole, Phipps. Makes me look a little too old. Makes me almost in the prime of life, eh, Phipps? No. For the future, perhaps a more trivial buttonhole on Thursday evenings? I will speak to the florist, my lord. She's had an unfortunate loss in her family lately, which may account for the lack of triviality your lordship complains of in the buttonhole. Extraordinary thing about the lower classes in England, Phipps. They are always losing their relations. Yes, my lord. They are extremely fortunate in that respect. Thank you, Phipps. That will do. Oh, and Phipps, I want my cab round at once, and I'm not at home to anyone. Really, Phipps' views on family life seem somewhat lax. What on earth is the use of having servants if they don't set one a good moral example? Among the works of James Joyce are Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, the short stories Dubliners, and a portrait of the artist as a young man, in which Stephen Dedalus is the main character. Now, Stephen, of course, is James Joyce himself. And in the novel, when he's finishing his secondary education in Dublin, he considers briefly becoming a priest, but he rejects that idea. And instead he goes for a walk out along the north side of Dublin to Clontarf. And he walks across a wooden bridge, which is still there today, out onto Dollymount Strand or beach. And on this strand, on this beach, he sees something which changes his whole perception of his future life. He sees a girl standing near the water's edge. She was alone and still and gazing out to sea. And when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. Long she suffered his gaze, then gently withdrew her eyes from his and bent them towards the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot, hither and thither. The first faint movement of the water broke the silence, low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, hither and thither, hither and thither. A faint flame trembled on her cheek. "Heavenly God," cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of profane joy. He turned away from her suddenly and set off across the strand. His cheeks were aflame, his body was aglow, his limbs were trembling. On and on and on, far off across the strand, singing wildly to the sea, crying out to greet the advent of the life that had cried to him. Her image had entered his soul, and no word had broken the silence of his ecstasy. Her eyes had called to him, and his soul had leaped at the call, to live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared before him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to open up before him the gates of all the ways of error and glory.